if fertilization occurs, this is where a fertilized zygote, that fertilized egg, is going to embed itself along the walls of that uterus. If you don't know what kind of the ovaries essentially look like, another vocab term that will kind of pop up throughout this day is the term follicle. And so basically the follicle is essentially what the egg is sort of embedded within. It's kind of a sac that sort of holds that egg together. Eventually, what will happen through this sort of hormonal series of processes is a follicle will kind of make its way to the outside of the ovaries and eventually kind of burst, releasing the egg. And that's that word that we already came up with, ovulation, the releasing of the egg from that follicle. And then the follicle essentially becomes a zombie, which we'll kind of talk about here in just a little bit. But its story isn't over once it bursts. Okay, so Karen says, are these organs physically connected? Well, no, answered Anne incredulously. You idiot. After all, my hypothalamus is up here, said Anne, pointing to her head. Genius. And my ovaries are down here, she continued, as she pointed to her jeans and then looked around self-consciously to see if she had been overheard.
Okay.
Good, nodded Karen. Good. So, how does the sorry, that's my inner Emperor Palpatine coming out. So, how does the hypothalamus communicate with the ovaries? Obvious logical question from Karen here. What hormones are involved? So y'all did a really good job, actually. Y'all pretty much nailed all of those organs that are kind of involved. So those are sort of, the sites of action, but the hormones can be thought of as the actual actors, the soldiers that kind of, move things along. So when we're talking about the menstrual cycle, what hormone vocab terms might come to mind?
LSH.
Estrogen. Oh, what?
LSH is it?
LSD is.
Oh, okay.
No, I'm kidding. No.
Follicle stimulating hormone?
Follicles, FSH and LH.
Luteinizing hormone?
Luteinizing hormone, and we'll differentiate between those two. But they're often really mixed up because it's not just, their acronyms might be kind of easy to mix up, but where they're produced and what they target also kind of heavily overlap. Any other hormone in there? So I heard estrogen, FSH, LH, estradiol. Yeah, so technically estradiol and estrogen do not refer to the exact same things. Estradiol is an estrogen. But for the purposes of 1302, just imagine that when you see estrogen, the textbook and the exams from the questions I've seen often use those words interchangeably. So just lump them together. There is a difference, but it's one that we can kind of talk about in future classes. There's another one.
Gonadotropin.
What's that?
Gonadotropin releasing hormone?
Yeah, gonadotropin releasing hormone, which has a special place in my own heart for a totally different reason because fish are weird. But yeah, GnRH.
Progesterone?
Progesterone is that other one. Yeah, so yeah, GnRH, FSH, LH, progesterone, estrogen or estradiol, which this class uses interchangeably. Sometimes there's another one that pops up, HCG, but we'll kind of see that a little bit more on Wednesday. For now, don't worry about it. We'll focus on it at another time because from my experience, at least for a lot of students, it's this is enough information, so we'll add HCG later. But yeah, basically, the reason HCG isn't included is because it's actually sort of what breaks this cycle, the menstrual cycle. So more on that later. But for now, really it's these 5 main ones. and what they stand for. So GnRH is gonadotropin releasing hormone, LH is luteinizing hormone, and FSH is follicle stimulating hormone. So those are those acronyms you want to get down. And then here we have them sort of color coded according to where they're produced. So not what they target, but who is producing them. 3 of these get produced in the brain itself, and the other 2 are actually within those primary reproductive organs. So within the ovary, we see estrogen and progesterone produced. But these other 3, even though they're reproductively related to the reproductive system, they're produced in the brain, which we often don't kind of give its due credit when we're talking about reproductive systems. We tend to focus, lower than in the brain itself. But GnRH essentially kind of kicks things off at the hypothalamus, and then the anterior pituitary kind of crosses the boundary from brain to those reproductive organs. And on that topic of kind of getting from the brain, that anterior pituitary to the ovaries, let's kind of ask how we might think they get there. How do hormones get from the anterior pituitary to the ovaries on iClicker here? So through gravity, because we're standing up a lot, through osmosis, through the bloodstream, through our interstitial fluid, or through nerve impulses. So through
The blood
nerve
access,
impulses.
right, chemicals. Mine keeps logging me
How do hormones get from the anterior pituitary to the ovaries? Gravity, osmosis, bloodstream, interstitial fluid, or the nerve impulses.
I'm logging in.
About 10 more seconds to finalize your answers. Let's see. Alright, so most support through C, then E. In the bloodstream, correct answer here. So yeah, hormones essentially get transmitted throughout the body through that bloodstream. Yeah, so you might think nerve impulses, since we're starting off at the brain, the central nervous system, but it actually courses through that bloodstream. Usually the what's kind of passing through nerve impulses are either kind of positive and electric charges or some neurotransmitters, which are also hormones in their own right, but these ones get transported through the bloodstream itself. Okay, so moving along, and Karen asked gingerly, do you know what happens during the menstrual cycle? Of course, replied Anne adamantly. So now y'all are all Anne. Can you explain what happens? So, does anyone want to kind of kick this off? What's the first thing? The release of the,
If it was a 28
not
cycle,
quite.
Is it the gonadotropin releasing hormone that stimulates the hypothalamus, or am I wrong?
You're almost there. You've got the actor right in the hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone. But what does it stimulate?
The anterior.
Yeah, so it's released by the hypothalamus, but it just goes a short distance, just straight to that anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is essentially going to kind of cascade from there. But the hypothalamus is that sort of first kind of trigger. Basically, it lets the anterior pituitary know. And then from there, what does the anterior pituitary do? Can anyone, does anyone remember? we'll walk through all of this too. I just kind of want to gauge at which point, you know, we're all familiar with versus, you know, what's unfamiliar.
Does it release follicle stimulating hormone?
Yeah, follicle stimulating hormone specifically. So yeah, let's kind of walk through this. Yeah, exactly. So the first step, yeah, is essentially the hypothalamus is going to just target right next door pretty much to that anterior pituitary. They're not adjacent to each other, but within the brain they're fairly close, only a few centimeters away. The hypothalamus releases gonadotropin releasing hormone, and it just kind of goes right next door to that anterior pituitary. Once the anterior pituitary feels gonadotropin releasing hormone building up within it, it's going to cause it to release that follicle stimulating hormone. And that follicle stimulating hormone is what's going to kind of travel across boundaries, past the brain, all the way to the reproductive system, specifically targeting those ovaries. And what does follicle stimulating hormone do exactly?
Stimulates the release of the follicle?
Stimulates the follicle, yeah. So it's literally just causing the follicle to grow a bit. So yeah, hence the name, follicle stimulating hormone. So this is going to be one of the ways to kind of tease apart what FSH versus LH do. Part of it is in the name itself. So yeah, the follicle stimulating hormone specifically is to grow that follicle. So the follicle is going to be the target of that follicle stimulating hormone. And so what happens next, so follicle will kind of grow from there, and as a result, the ovary is going to start releasing estrogen, which your textbook again uses sort of interchangeably with estradiol, and that's going to affect the uterus. Basically what's going to happen at this point is the uterus is going to start kind of thickening its inner lining, what we call that endometrium. And this is for a specific purpose. So if an egg gets fertilized, it kind of needs a landing pad that's going to nourish that egg. So we saw the equivalent in plants, right? There was that endosperm, which provides nutrients to the fertilized egg. The endometrium is kind of like that in that sense. So the egg, if it's fertilized, is going to land on the endometrium, and that's going to kind of supply that egg with the necessary environment to grow. So, you know, the ovary has to get that uterus prepped, that endometrium prepped. So it does so by producing estrogen specifically. And so what will happen at this point is estrogen is going to kind of build up a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more, and eventually it's going to kind of hit a sort of breaking point, where once there's a certain amount of estrogen in the bloodstream, the pituitary is actually going to feel this again. And it's going to kind of release the floodgates of not just follicle stimulating hormone, but now a second hormone as well. So the anterior pituitary produces two hormones, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. And it'll release this sort of floodgate of the two once estrogen levels have built up kind of past capacity, you can say. It sort of unleashes this floodgate of these two hormones. And so yeah, the anterior pituitary releases a surge of LH, which again is targeting the same thing, the ovary. And what this is going to do when the LH sort of hits the ovary is it's going to cause ovulation. So specifically, it's going to, that follicle that has been growing in response to the increasing follicle stimulating hormone is now going to get to a breaking point, literally. It's going to kind of rupture. What's inside that follicle is the egg, and the egg is now going to kind of travel downstream through the oviducts, and if it gets fertilized, land on the uterus. But that follicle has now burst open thanks to this flooding of FSH and LH. And then the follicle isn't done then. It's kind of burst open, And it's going to essentially transform into another vocab term, which is called the corpus luteum. And this name kind of gives you the hint regarding the LH, which is luteinizing hormone. It creates that luteum. So the luteum and luteinizing come from the same word. And so the FSH kind of builds up the follicle stimulating hormone, and then that flood of LH turns the follicle, it kind of breaks it open, and it becomes the corpus luteum. But all it literally is actually scar tissue. So the follicle, when it bursts open, just like if you get a scab and it heals back over, it forms scar tissue. That scar tissue here just serves a different purpose. That scar tissue is the corpus luteum. And what it's going to do as a result, once it becomes this scar tissue, is it's going to produce kind of the last hormone that we haven't really talked about, which is the progesterone. So the ovary produces estrogen, and then that follicle that's now sort of ruptured open and becomes scar tissue, that corpus luteum, it's now producing a hormone in and of itself. It's producing progesterone, which also targets that uterus. So ovary and follicles, they both produce hormones, they both target the uterus, but there's a timing difference here, right? So the ovary is producing estrogen kind of earlier in the cycle, and then that follicle that's now burst, the corpus luteum, in the latter half is producing this next hormone, the progesterone. And basically this is where kind of a timer starts. So as long as estrogen and progesterone levels are high, what they do is a couple of things. So they're nourishing the uterus, they're kind of keeping that endometrium relatively thick, but they're also creating what's called a negative feedback loop, back to the brain. So, if you look here, the brain sort of needs something to let it know what's going on down near those primary reproductive organs. So it's been releasing luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. It needs a check, something to tell it, okay, you can stop producing this hormone now. The follicle already burst, it already produced the corpus luteum. And that's what the estrogen and progesterone do. So on top of directly kind of keeping that endometrium relatively thick, it also tells the anterior pituitary to kind of shut up, to stop producing the FSH and LH. Let us kind of do our thing for a little bit of time, and once estrogen and progesterone levels are low, then you can start building those hormones again. So yeah, as long as estrogen and progesterone are at high levels, then the anterior pituitary will kind of stop producing FSH and LH. So this is what we refer to as that negative feedback loop. So the production of FSH and LH goes down when the production of estrogen and progesterone go up. So the production of one hormone inhibits the production of another. That's all that's meant by negative feedback. A positive feedback loop would be the opposite, where more of hormone A makes more of hormone B. They just keep building up on each other. This is a negative feedback loop. Production of one inhibits the production of another.
So
Yep.
when estrogen and progesterone increase, the FSH and LH will decrease.
Yeah. So, it's important though. The estrogen and progesterone need to be at high levels. But this is kind of a timer at this point. The corpus luteum is scar tissue. And what happens to many scars, you have some scars that are permanent, but whenever there's a wound, it eventually gets healed, right? And so that's actually the same thing that's going on right here. So this, even though it's producing an important hormone, is scar tissue that can be repaired. And in fact, it does degrade. It takes almost exactly 14 days for the corpus luteum to degenerate. And so basically the body's immune system will kind of get rid of the corpus luteum. And so since the corpus luteum is no longer present, what is no longer produced?
Progesterone.
Yeah, progesterone. So the corpus luteum makes progesterone. no corpus luteum, no progesterone. No progesterone, no negative feedback on the anterior pituitary. Now we can start making FSH and LH again, and you can start to see a cycle start to form. So FSH goes back up, eventually another follicle is going to burst, that's going to make progesterone. It goes up, FSH and LH goes down. It just keeps cycling between high levels of FSH and LH and high levels of estrogen and more specifically progesterone. So yeah, if no fertilization occurs, that's what happens. The corpus luteum kind of degenerates after 14 days, and then there's no longer enough progesterone to make this negative feedback. And what happens as a result is that the progesterone, which is also thickening the lining of this uterus, without enough progesterone, it's not going to thicken that lining anymore, and it's actually going to be shed. And that is that process, that shedding process, what we call menses, when the endometrium gets passed, essentially. So yeah, progesterone levels they lower over time as the corpus luteum degrades, which stops this negative feedback loop, but it also stops the thickening of that endometrium. So we'll kind of walk through this again, and we'll draw it out on the board. But if there's kind of one image you want to get down in your head regarding reproductive systems for animals, it's going to be kind of this one, or what we'll see here in a couple of slides regarding the sort of production of different hormones. But you definitely want to have kind of the ins and outs of this down, and you should be good regarding reproductive system content for unit exam 3. But before we get to that second graph that I'll show you, let's kind of ask this iClicker question, which should be easy if you were paying attention. So unless a pregnancy occurs, the corpus luteum will degenerate after 6, 10, 12, 14, or 18 days. iClicker. About 10 more seconds. Finalize your answers and see. All right, good. Overwhelming support here. 14 days, and that's the correct answer here. So, this. So this number actually is relatively fixed, plus or minus 1 to 2 days. But 14 days is a lot more fixed than the sort of range, any other phase of the menstrual cycle or the total length of the menstrual cycle. This part is pretty fixed, that the corpus luteum degenerates after about 14 days. So what that means is we can actually count back 14 days from the first day of menstruation to determine an individual's day of ovulation. So ovulation is when that corpus luteum is formed. And from there, there's a 14-day timer, essentially. That's almost, with a few exceptions, universal across women, that 14-day period. The first phase, which we refer to as the follicular phase, when it's not a corpus luteum, it's a follicle, that varies from individual to individual. This luteal phase, though, referring to the phase where the follicle is a corpus luteum, is generally fixed at about 14 days there. So there's variation from individual to individual, but luteal phase is a lot more fixed than the follicular phase. And so I sort of present this graph here because this is often what you'll see in your textbook, kind of a typical textbook diagram that provides a summary of the menstrual cycle. And there's a lot of information actually on here. So this might be another figure you'd want to kind of have down and at least understand in its entirety for the unit exam, because there's a lot of information that we'll kind of cover in the next few slides, but it's summed up here. First of all is the fact that the menstrual cycle occurs in these kind of two main phases, the follicular phase and the luteal phase. And it all has to do with that one actor, the follicle. That we're talking about the same thing when we're talking about a follicle versus a corpus luteum. It's just, has that follicle burst or not? So in the follicular phase, it's kind of growing. It ruptures. That rupturing is ovulation because the egg is inside that follicle. So when it ruptures, the egg is released. And now what's left over? A follicle that turns into the corpus luteum. So that follicle is now in the luteal phase. So these are kind of multiple vocab terms, follicle and corpus luteum, but it kind of makes it easier to grasp if you realize that they're the same thing, actually. It's just one, their first life versus second life. This second graph we'll kind of talk about in a little bit, and this is actually maybe even an exaggeration, but basal body temperatures tend to be higher just by a couple tenths of a degree during this luteal phase. So after ovulation, when progesterone is starting to ramp up, basal body temperatures are relatively higher. But the most important kind of part here is probably this figure. It's been asked in the past as a short answer question to kind of label each of these hormones and describe where they're produced and what they target. And this diagram is literally just what we've walked through displayed on one graph. So, if we talk about the follicle stimulating hormone, it's sort of being produced at the beginning. The follicle kind of targets the uterus through the production of estrogen, which is going to ramp up and up and up. And remember, I said estrogen is going to keep getting produced until it reaches that sort of critical point. It's kind of going to release the floodgates in the anterior pituitary. And so when it releases that, or when it kind of reaches that breaking point, the anterior pituitary will kind of just release all the FSH it has left and all the LH too. One kind of description, one analogy I use is like estrogen. Think of it as kind of pushing on a door that says pull in the anterior pituitary. It keeps building up, and eventually with enough pressure, even though that door says pull, it's going to break. And that door is going to break open, and it's going to release all the FSH and LH that's within it. So in this big burst of LH and the remaining FSH, this is what causes ovulation. The follicle receives this burst of LH, and it bursts the follicle right open. The egg comes out. Corpus luteum is formed, and that's why we see no progesterone at the beginning, and then suddenly kind of a rise in progesterone, because the corpus luteum hasn't existed as the corpus luteum until this point of ovulation. So corpus luteum is the source of progesterone, and it's going to keep increasing until kind of halfway through its lifespan, and then it's going to, as it degenerates over time, produce less and less of that progesterone. Once not enough progesterone is released, this follicle stimulating hormone can start to ramp back up. This is just showing that negative feedback loop again. Once there's not enough progesterone to kind of tell the anterior pituitary to stop making FSH, it'll start making FSH again. So you want to make sure to have kind of this diagram down too. Understand all of this, but if there was one aspect you want to kind of know the ins and outs of, it's this one right here. This next one, the ovarian cycle, is really just kind of pictographically showing what we've already described. The follicular phase, think of The follicle, remember, has the egg inside. It's constantly growing until it finally ruptures, and then it becomes the corpus luteum, which degrades. And then lastly, we can ask, this is telling us what's happening in the ovaries, but the ovaries are different than the uterus. So what's happening in the uterus? That endometrium is kind of thickening over time, but eventually it gets shed if pregnancy does not occur. And then that's what we call menses, the shedding of that endometrium. And so in terms of the uterus, there are 3 phases. They're called menses, the endometrium shedding, the proliferative, and the secretory for secretion phase of the uterine cycle. So, yeah, I spend a lot of time on this today only because, it does make up, when it comes to reproductive systems in the unit exam and the final, it makes up a sort of disproportionate amount of the questions there. So, a lot of information there, but let's try to see, what all has stuck. I'm not expecting by the end of even this activity everything to stick. That's why we're going to kind of keep looking at it in different ways. We'll do a group activity in the latter half of class period today. But let's kind of ask the next, well, I just gave you the answer. Whoops. But, yeah, there we go. Damn you, clicker. So yeah, without the corpus luteum and the progesterone, the uterine lining will eventually shed. So remember, the progesterone is what kind of feeds that endometrium, that uterine lining. So without progesterone, it can't keep thickening and eventually it just sheds. Okay, back to our friends Ann and Karen.
You should let the class participate.
In this?
Not in the reading.
Oh yeah, I tried that last semester. Everyone was so shy. But okay, yeah, that's only fair. I'll randomly choose Abraham. Okay, you can be Karen.
Wow. Carino.
Karen? Yeah. Where would you start if you were Karen? Yeah. You're Karen. And then yeah, let's see. Minok, you can be Anne.
Okay, what was the first day of your last menstrual cycle?
February 2nd,
And what was the first day of the cycle before that?
January 1st.
So how long is your personal menstrual cycle?
So Anne pauses to think. So, yeah. So can anyone do that math?
So first day was February 2nd. Wouldn't that be like a month?
Yeah, it's like a month. How many days? How many days in January? 31.
28? Oh, sorry,
Wow.
February. I was thinking February, man.
Yeah. No, I thought
No,
that
because
too
I
at
said
first.
the
I was
same
like,
thing
okay,
you said
starting in
exactly.
February. No, yeah. So it's well, let me just. Okay, it says it's 32 days long.
Okay.
Okay, so your cycle's 32 days long. Okay, keep going, Karen.
So your cycle is 32 days long. Can you figure out when you ovulate?
I don't feel when I ovulate.
Most women do not, but there are signs.
Abraham, why would you know that? Yeah, so this gets to that basal body temperature. So, it's only a change on average of actually like 2 to 3/10 of a degree Fahrenheit, which is not 2 to 3/10 of a degree Celsius, which is what that other figure showed. But the general gist of it is similar, that during that luteal phase, the basal body temperature tends to be up slightly higher than during the follicular phase, which is actually what this is showing here. Also, just like a side weird fact is that there actually are a few women who can kind of feel when ovulation happens, like the moment it actually happens.
Usually on one side, right?
What's that?
Is it usually on one side or the other?
Yeah, so they can physically feel it. And it's called, I had to write it down, it's called Mittelschmerz.
Middle.
Yeah. Yeah, Google it. But yeah, it's yeah.
Middle Schwartz?
Yeah, Mittelschmerz. But yeah, you can actually, those individuals, my sister-in-law claims to have it, but I don't know, she also believes in some weird stuff. So, but yeah, the middle schmerz is an actual phenomenon that a small subset of women can actually feel that moment of ovulation. But, you know, even if you're not feeling it, something actually is happening physiologically in terms of that basal body temperature. It does go up a little bit, not much, but sometimes you might feel kind of the occasional hot flash or something. And so, yeah, I mean, usually we kind of, I assume everyone was listening, but just to kind of check, we'll ask this eye clicker, literally what I just said. After ovulation, for the remainder of the cycle, a woman's basal body temperature does what? Doesn't change at all, oscillates, kind of generating these hot flashes, goes up slightly and stays up, or it goes down slightly and stays down. About 10 seconds. Finalize your answers. Okay, yeah. Some of y'all weren't listening. But yeah, it goes up slightly and stays up during that luteal phase. So after ovulation. Luteal phase started by this surge of luteinizing hormone. The luteal phase is when the corpus luteum is made. Lots of lutes at the end in the second half of the menstrual cycle there. So yeah, and one side effect is that the temperature does kind of go up slightly and stays up at that point. All right, so also the reason it's kind of called the secretory phase, I know, I try to glance past this slide, but in the uterus, that secretory phase does have to do with the fact that cervical secretions will kind of go up at this point. The consistency will change, and but yeah, that is why it's called the secretory phase. It's during the second half. That's what's happening in the uterus. The point I talk about that I feel like I am eligible to add to is kind of the evolutionary aspect and the animal behavior side of things, since that's my background. There's a sort of series of hypotheses that explain kind of how menstruation evolved in humans. So first of all, we're one of only a few mammals that actually menstruate monthly. So it's just kind of humans, a handful of primates, and then a smattering of kind of other seemingly random species. But the other animals, because remember, this is animal reproduction, so what are the other animals doing? They enter a phase called estrus instead. So menstruation is different than estrus, but with estrus cycles, they essentially kind of lead to all these behavioral changes that will kind of modulate female behavior to kind of be more sexually receptive, like in things like mice. They can kind of, they'll go into this estrus behavior where they arch their back. Essentially, kind of they'll go in front of a male to show that now is the kind of key time to fertilize an egg.
Cats do that too.
Cats do it too, yeah. A lot of animals, the majority of animals actually go through estrus cycles. We're sort of an exception to that rule. So the other thing is that unlike other animals, even other animals that menstruate, like primates, humans don't have kind of physical external advertisements of this. So you might have heard of baboons, where females, when they menstruate, they actually kind of develop this really large red coloring around their vagina, and it's to advertise that they're ready to mate, essentially.
You said baboons?
What's that?
What-
Yeah, and baboons, yeah. And other primates too, but baboons are where, you'll see textbook pictures of it.
I thought you were going to say they advertise their butt.
I mean, that's what it looks like. Sometimes when you see the picture, it looks like that, actually. It looks like it is their butt, but it's not. It just looks like something's gone seriously wrong. But, yeah, so, but the other thing is, okay, how come humans didn't develop this sort of external advertising? And sort of one hypothesis about this kind of relates actually to what's more unique about humans, which is pair bond formation. So the idea is if a male does not know when a woman ovulates, then there's uncertainty. She could be ovulating at any point, so it actually strengthens the formation of a pair bond. There's kind of some literature to back this up in like some of the few primate species that sometimes engage in monogamy. You'll see that in those populations where, so basically there's a species of white-handed gibbon in Western Africa, and some populations, they're just totally monogamous. They're in a forest, and you just see every male pairing up with the female, and you go 4 or 5 kilometers away to literally another gibbon town, and they're all mating with each other, males mating multiply, females mating multiply. And one difference is that in that population where they're mating monogamously, the females aren't, having that sort of red coloration as extremely as in the populations where they aren't mating monogamously. So there's some backing to that. There's other things about that population, like in the monogamous populations, they also kind of eat their children, but
Whoa.
that's sort of a side thing. We've all been there.
Have we?
With the monogamous populations, they eat their children?
Yeah, so the other sort of hypothesis is actually pair bond formation is to kind of keep other individuals from eating your babies. Yeah, so you don't eat your own children.
Oh, okay.
You're
It's
eating,
the other ones.
Yeah, they're not monsters. They're eating other humans'
Okay.
children. Yeah.
Interesting.
And so they think it might have evolved also, and it may not be one thing, it may be both things. A little bit of the external advertisement playing part of that picture, and then the benefit that my babies aren't being eaten.
The Sodom and Gomorrah gibbons, they advertise more or no?
The Sodom and Gomorrah ones.
The
I
pagans.
get that. No, yeah. So that infanticidal cannibalism is not as high in those populations. So they mate multiply. They don't have to worry about others eating their children,
That's
and
the monogamy
so
one.
what's that?
You said the monogamy. Oh no,
So-
you said the other.
Yeah,
population.
so in the monogamy is essentially a tool they use to keep others from
Okay,
eating their
okay.
babies, because now it's 2 eyes on the baby.
Okay. So,
Yeah.
so there's more cannibalism in the polygamous population, and that same population, they also advertise their parts more.
Not as much though.
They advertise their
Genitalia.
menstruation more, yes.
Okay, so okay.
Their ovulation,
That makes
I should
sense.
say.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, okay, so a new Ann and Karen. Let's go with Carlina, you can be Ann. Taylor, you'll be Karen.
But I didn't watch out for those signs.
Oh yeah, you're wailing.
Even if you did not, we can still calculate when you ovulated.
Don't you want to? All right, so now we're coming back to this question. Different numbers though. So based on what we kind of learned, Anne has a 32-day cycle. When will she ovulate? She will ovulate on day 6, 10, 12, 14, or 18. Anne has a 32-day cycle. When will she ovulate? Anne has a 32-day cycle. She will ovulate on day 6, 10, 12, 14, or 18. Alright, 10 seconds to finalize your answers. Let's see if we've got this down, and alright, getting there. And I can see why people put 14, but the right answer is 18 here. So how did we get there?
Just subtract 14.
32, yeah, day cycle. What you want to do is essentially number of days of the cycle, subtract 14. Why do we do that? Because that 14-day period is the luteal phase, which tends to be fixed from individual to individual. So even if you have a 24-day cycle, 28-day cycle, 32-day cycle, this phase, the luteal phase, is sort of fixed at 14 days. So you just subtract 14. So when does ovulation occur in a 24-day cycle? 24 minus 14 gives you 10. 28-day cycle gives us that average answer of 14, which might have been kind of the first day you thought, but it only applies to a 28-day cycle. 32-day cycle, 32 minus 14, ovulation in all these cases happening 14 days before the end of the cycle. So in this case, ovulation at day 18. So yeah, if you were to put timelines and line them up according to ovulation, the second half would always kind of look the same. The first half is really what differs. The follicular phase differs from individual to individual. All right, so sort of out of nowhere here. Within the female human body, sperm can survive up to how many days? You're not expected to know this answer, but kind of segues into the last part of their conversation. Within the female human body, sperm can survive up to 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days.
I feel like I've heard that 5 days.
Yeah, I think so too.
All right, finalize your answers.
No, I'm just being practically talking to myself.
See, ooh, all over the place. But most support for 2 days or 5 days. Yeah, you're not expected necessarily to know this, but it is up to 5 days that the sperm can survive in that female human body. So when we think of that sort of window of opportunity for fertilization, you know, if, you know, in this case, who was it? Who's the one? Anne? So if Anne ovulated on day 18, there's a 5-day window before that where she's, you know, at risk. Yeah. Yeah. Or you know, maybe it's a good thing. I don't know. She's not treating it like it's a good thing. So, all right. So you, Ann, and Karen. We've got. Let's go with Leroy. You're Ann, and Jose. Yeah, you can be Karen.
The intro.
So I ovulated on day 18.
Yes, you did.
Oh man, alright. Alright, we don't go up here. Alright, since we had sex on day 16, I have nothing to worry about.
Please read the script, Leroy. Oh, you
Say that again, Well, not necessarily. A male sperm can stay alive in a female body for up to 5 days.
You have got to be kidding.
But
Oh.
but you said you had a 28-day cycle, when in fact you were just 32. So guess what? You're not late.
All right. reveal. Anne isn't late. End of season 1. Yeah. So yeah, then a week later, you know, they meet for coffee, and Karen says, "I didn't hear from you," so I assumed. Well, asked Karen, picking up their conversation from the previous week. "I got my period," said Anne. "I never counted how many days were between my periods," she admitted sheepishly. "John and I are checking our options for family planning. I'm not ready yet to be a mom. At least you know your body better now. What kind of coffee do you want?"
My treat.
The more you know.
Caffeine's not good for you.
Yeah, that's how that ends. That's the end of that whole thing. Made it through. Yeah. So, what I want to do now is just another group activity. Let's get the tables together for this one, because I only printed out enough, one for every table, because this was so much to cut.
But it's on Black. No, it's on.
It is on Blackboard, on PowerPoint.
But you can't
So
cut it.
you can edit it. You should be able. If you open it on PowerPoint, you can edit it. So yeah, take advantage of that because I just have one physical copy per team. But yeah, you can do this on Blackboard too. And let's kind of, I'll sort of pull it up and walk you through what you want to do more or less. I'll go, an envelope, all sorts of